Welcome to the second video as part of our ecology unit. This particular video is going to cover all the biogeochemical cycles that are essential for life on Earth. So the first cycle we're going to talk about is one that you're probably pretty familiar with. It is called the hydrologic cycle. That prefix hydro means water, so in other words, we're going to talk about the water cycle. The water cycle is a circular pathway of water on Earth. It starts in the atmosphere, goes to the surface, below ground, and then back to the atmosphere again. Hence the name, the water cycle. So here's a quick image of the water cycle for you. It occurs in 5 steps. Step 1 is precipitation, so any sort of water falling from the sky, rain, snow, sleet, all of that counts as precipitation. The second step is surface runoff and groundwater seepage. So that means the water hits the surface of the earth, runs down mountains, rivers, across flatlands, and seeps into the ground. So you know how you see puddles and then suddenly those puddles disappear? Well, part of that is they're evaporating, but it's not all evaporating. A lot of it is going down into the groundwater, where then we can tap into sources of it for things like wells. Something to think about when we talk about surface runoff is everything that water comes into contact with as it runs across the surface of the earth is going to contaminate and be a part of that water source. So if you change the oil in your car and the oil gets all over your driveway, and then it rains and washes all of that into the gutter at the end of your driveway, all of that oil and the contaminants in that are now in the surface runoff and could potentially get into the groundwater. So that's why when you're, for example, on the show like Survivor, you always boil your water source prior to drinking it because of what the water can pick up on its way to bodies of water like rivers, lakes, oceans, or as it is before it is filtered in by different sources. The next is water is stored in the oceans, and then evaporation and transpiration happen, and then condensation, and then everything starts back over with precipitation. So evaporation is the water evaporating from a body of water like a river, lake, or ocean. Transpiration is plants basically breathing out water. And then condensation is when the temperature of the water changes and causes it to go back into cloud form. And particles of water, molecules of water, accumulate and make clouds. So next we are going to talk about biogeochemical cycles. A biogeochemical cycle is the movement of a chemical through living and non-living parts of an ecosystem. So that biogeochemical, let's break that word down. Bio means living, geo means earth. Chemical is obviously referring to the chemical moving through the environment. So the word actually tells you what it means. It accounts for all living and non-living parts of an ecosystem and as they cycle and are reused. So the first biogeochemical cycle is the oxygen cycle. We've actually referred to this earlier in the year when we studied cellular respiration and photosynthesis. So oxygen starts in the atmosphere, and it's not in as great a quantity as you would probably think because the majority of our atmosphere is actually made up of nitrogen. But oxygen is breathed in and goes through the process of cellular respiration in organisms. And then carbon dioxide is released from those organisms, which is then taken up in photosynthesis and used to recreate oxygen again. So that's kind of the oxygen cycle. The next cycle we're going to talk about is the carbon cycle. So carbon is one of those essential building blocks of life. We talked a lot about carbon when we did the biochemistry unit. It is what all organic molecules are made of. Remember, that's the definition of organic, is carbon containing. So carbon is essential to all living things. Those things, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, are all based on the molecule carbon. So it is very important that we have the ability to recycle carbon molecules. So carbon can be found in the abiotic world, in the non-living world, in several forms. Carbon dioxide is a gas in the atmosphere, just like we referred to in the oxygen cycle. Bicarbonate, fossil fuels, which are underground deposits of oil, natural gas, and coal. Carbonate rocks, such as limestone, and dead organic matter, such as humus in the soil. So carbon can be found in all of these things in the non-living world. So here's a picture and a graphic of how carbon is recycled. So it starts off as carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide goes through photosynthesis, and then after photosynthesis, the decomposition of organisms leads to fossil fuels. So organisms decompose, that gets compressed down through geological processes, and fossil fuels then develop. Well, then we burn those fossil fuels and we combust them, and that leads to carbon dioxide being put back into the atmosphere. We also respire. We do cellular respiration, which leads to more CO2 in the atmosphere, which then relies on more photosynthesis to recycle that carbon dioxide over and over and over again and put it into usable forms. The next is the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen makes up approximately 78% of the Earth's atmosphere. We think, well, we breathe in oxygen, but if our atmosphere is made mostly of nitrogen gas, that must be a lot of nitrogen gas. Well, nitrogen's very important in making a lot of our organic molecules, a lot of our molecules that are essential for life. And so the problem comes, and the reason for the nitrogen cycle is we can't use nitrogen in the form of nitrogen gas. We can only use it in ammonium and nitrate forms. So we have some molecules, some things that help us to get it into usable form. The first is nitrogen fixation. It takes advantage of some bacteria that can convert gaseous nitrogen, so nitrogen from the air, into ammonia. So we can use ammonium and nitrate. So nitrogen fixation happens in the nodules or the little outgrowths on the roots of plants, things like beans and peas. So if you look at the picture there on the left of your screen, that shows some nodules that contain bacteria that can fix nitrogen into a form we can use. So then nitrates are released by those bacteria and taken up into plants, which then converts them into organic compounds like amino acids and proteins. So nitrates are used by plants, which then we eat plants and can access that nitrogen. So denitrifying bacteria use nitrate as an oxygen source, and they release nitrogen gas into the atmosphere as a waste product. So we're starting that cycle back over again. So some of the nitrogen enters the soil as a result of fixation by lightning. So you think, oh, lightning actually has a very important biogeochemical function. So nitrogen recombines with oxygen in the air, forming nitrous oxide, or nitrogen oxide, sorry. Nitrogen oxide and water makes nitrates that can be absorbed by the soil. So we also have the ability to fix nitrogen from the air using lightning to make it into a form that plants and animals can use. So I have another graphic for you. So on the right-hand side, you see the two ways that we can fix nitrogen in the air into nitrates. We use this bacteria at the top, or a lightning strike. And then, so we take ammonia and change it into nitrates. And then animals eat the plants to get their protein. Well, the plants take it in, and then the animals get rid of nitrogenous waste again. And then the ammonia is in the nitrogenous waste, or from the decay of the nitrogenous waste, goes back into that denitrifying bacteria, making nitrates, feeding the animals again and again. So this cycle kind of has multiple parts that take it back to the atmosphere and then back into plants. So I wanted to take a quick second to point out bacteria. So you always hear bacteria, bad thing, bacteria, bad thing. They're really not always a bad thing. They help break down food in your digestive system. They help decompose organic matter so that we can use that stuff in it, and so our waste isn't so great. They're used to make some foods. Bacteria make yogurt, and they also fix nitrogen in plants. So bacteria are not always a bad thing. That's why it's important if you're on like an antibiotic or something because you're sick, that you eat lots of foods like yogurts and probiotics that are good, that have some good digestive bacteria, because sometimes that antibiotic will wipe all of those good bacteria out, and then your stomach gets upset and you're not able to break down really complex foods like plant matter and things that our body can't naturally break down by itself, like cellulose. So our next cycle is the phosphorus cycle, and this is the final cycle we're going to cover here. But large amounts of phosphorus, sorry, I skipping ahead of myself. So the phosphate is released by weathering rocks in an ecosystem. Plants and fungi take up the phosphate. It moves through the food web, and then it's locked in the bottom of bodies of water. So let's think about, why is phosphorus or why is phosphate important? We have some very important molecules in our lives that rely on a phosphate molecule. So let's think about DNA. A nucleotide of DNA has a phosphate, a deoxyribose sugar, and a nitrogen base. Without that phosphate, that nucleotide wouldn't be able to form the proper sugar phosphate backbone that is essential for DNA structure. The same for RNA. RNA is a phosphate, a ribose sugar, and a nitrogen base. So all of those rely on phosphate for their proper functioning and shape. The other one is a little molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Okay, so it's in the word ATP, and in order for ATP to give us energy, we have to break a phosphate off and put a phosphate on. Well, if that phosphate isn't there to make that high energy bond, we can't get energy. So we can't even do things like make a new cell or think or breathe or talk. Any of these things that require energy are impossible without a phosphate. But here's the problem. If we have too much phosphorus in a system, we lead to algal blooms. It crowds out other species and impacts wildlife negatively. So if you've ever been to Lake Greenwood in South Carolina, those algal blooms tend to happen fairly frequently because the lake does what's called turnover, and the algae blooms really heavily on the top of the surface, which means that light can't penetrate to the lower levels of the water, and then organisms don't have what they need to eat to live. This is really kind of a negative impact, and the reason that I point this out is because we, as a society, tend to dump a lot of stuff into our water, and this is a problem because things like our detergent for our clothes used to contain a high amount of phosphorus, and as people were washing clothes, that phosphorus was then leaching into our water systems, which caused lots of standing bodies of water to do what we call eutrophy, which is what you see in the pictures here. And essentially, the body of water completely disappeared. And if water is so essential to life, we really can't afford to have it disappearing from the planet.